Okay, hi, it's Professor Joyce. We're back again for a recitation for Economics 1001. Today we're going to do Chapter 4, which, as you can know from class, is supply and demand, and it's a rather essential chapter for what we're going to do throughout the entire book. So this recitation has particular resonance for me, and I hope for you as well, given its importance for the rest of the course. So without further ado, hopefully you've downloaded the questions I've posted on Blackboard. We're going to do today, as we do every recitation, we're going to do our 10-question quiz. I will try to give you some background on some of the questions, but I'll go through fairly in detail exactly what the question is looking for, what answers I think you should be focusing on, and again, what answers may trip you up and hopefully won't during the test. All right? I think the importance of these recitations is that these are questions that really come from the type of question we'll be using in the test. Again, so if this is, I think this will be great practice and hopefully you stay through the whole time. So as before, I will do a question. I'll read the question. I will stop at that point. I will let you try to answer the questions. Then I will come back on and we'll work through the answers one by one together. All right, so let's get started. So chapter 4, number 1, the first question I had for you, it says, suppose the demand decreases and supply decreases. What would you expect to occur in the market for this good? So, supply and demand are both decreasing, and the first thing I want you to do in these problems, always in supply and demand, is draw it. If you draw it and then go get an answer in your head for yourself, you will do much better than if you start looking for the answers in the multiple choice selection, because it's very easy to get tripped up in some of the language here. So let's look at it. Let's start right off the bat with our supply and demand curve. Excuse me. There's our demand curve. There's our supply curve. We'll call this S naught and D naught. We'll put quantity in this axis and we'll put price in this axis. This is not the best color, so let me kind of get a deeper color. All right, so it says both supply and demand decrease, right? So we know a supply decrease is going to move the supply curve back. So we can move it back like this, and I'll draw it in a broken sequence so you can tell. So we're going to label this supply 1. And we know demand decreases, so we're going to push this back as well, and we're going to label this D1. All right, so this is the decrease in the supply curve, and this is the decrease in the demand curve. Let's go to our original equilibrium point, the lighter blue curve there, and this we will draw as equilibrium original, so we'll put E0, and this gives us the equilibrium quantity we had before the change, and there's the price. So the question's pushing you to figure out what's going to happen to equilibrium price and quantity here when both the supply curve and the demand curve are shifting back here. All right, to answer that, we go to our new equilibrium point. All right, and this gets a little bit interesting. So here, we'll call this Q1. And we're going to label the price up here. Kind of interesting, right? Where I'm drawing this price, we're going to call that P1, and I'll push it right there. So now you have to ask yourself, and as we've done in class in these particular problems, when the demand curve shifted down, decreased in this particular case, we noticed that there was a decrease in equilibrium price and a decrease in equilibrium quantity. In other words, if only the demand curve shifted, if you ignore the supply curve shift for the moment, what you'll notice is that the new demand curve, this one right here, would have hit the original supply curve at a smaller quantity and at a lower price. In other words, a decrease in demand puts downward pressure on both quantity and price. Look at the supply curve. The supply curve shifted backwards. In other words, we had a decrease in supply. And yet, if there had been no shift in the demand curve, if we can do that exercise again, if only the supply curve had shifted back, then what you would have observed has been an increase in equilibrium price, but again, a decrease in equilibrium quantity. In other words, the decrease in supply puts upward pressure on price and downward pressure on equilibrium quantity, whereas the demand curve puts downward pressure on both price and quantity. In other words, the new equilibrium has to be at a lower equilibrium quantity. Why? Because both the shift in demand and supply are putting downward pressure on the new equilibrium. But the price effects are offsetting, and I'm not quite sure which one's going to win out, right? In other words, I could have shifted the demand curve down a great deal, we would have ended up with a lower equilibrium price. Or I could have shifted the supply curve back a great deal and would have ended up with a higher equilibrium price. In other words, the decrease in the supply is pushing price up, the decrease in demand is pushing price down. Which one dominates, I don't know. Therefore, the result for equilibrium price is going to be ambiguous. So, go to your choices. The first answer says equilibrium price will increase, all right, but the impact in equilibrium quantity would be ambiguous. Well, we know that's not true. We know it's not true because the opposite is the case, that equilibrium quantity has to fall because both curves, both shifts, are putting downward pressure on equilibrium quantity. So that's out. If you go to B, equilibrium price would decrease, right, so far, but the impact in equilibrium quantity would be ambiguous. Again, the equilibrium quantity is not ambiguous, and the decrease in price is also wrong, actually. I think I misspoke there for a minute. So let's go to C. Equilibrium quantity would decrease. Yes, we have that shown there. But the impact in equilibrium price would be ambiguous. And that is the answer. The answer is C. Again, we have these offsetting forces. The supply shift is pushing up equilibrium price. The demand shift is pushing it down. That's going to be ambiguous. And just for completion, let's go back to number D. It says both equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity would increase. Well, that's crazy because they're not going to increase, right? We know equilibrium quantity unambiguously has to fall. So the answer to number 1 here is clearly C. But again, it's a very good question. You're forced to draw the curves, and you're forced to kind of work through the answers after you've drawn them. So let me stop there, erase this. We'll go on to number 2. I'll pause, give you a moment to kind of answer things, and we'll come back.